what I'm going to describe today is the kind of current place of the work of the Broadband Forum that enables automation. Now, we do have some automation projects that have been started, but there's some particular ones that enabling projects that I'd like to cover. And, you know, maybe before I sort of start, I'll say as well that there's particular things that have always motivated the Broadband Forum, or, you know, things that, in terms of requirements, that we see as being most important. And that's certainly what we get from our operator members. And there's sort of two things, I mean, and they're very closely related. So migration from today's broadband network to that future state, and coexistence, obviously, in the near term. And it should be remembered that today's broadband networks are, it's 1 billion subscribers. So obviously huge investment, huge revenues. So how do you protect that and move forward at the same time? So just very quickly, just to sort of say a bit more about the organization. This is kind of the, you know, the place that we sort of come from. So obviously we're a membership-driven organization, 160 members, all of the major players within the broadband space. So, you know, obviously the service providers, the vendor community, and all of the component manufacturers. I would say, though, increasingly software players, but I'm sure you're not surprised by me sort of saying that. I think that's probably true across most standards organizations. So who are all of our members? So as I said, sort of service providers, vendors, the component makers, and other kind of influencers, so organizations, test labs, those kind of players. Now, one thing we've done in the last sort of few years is really to try and rationalize what we're doing into some particular areas of work. So it might surprise you a little bit to see some of these. So 5G is very much a big focus for us now, mostly driven by, obviously, all the convergence activities. So we have a particular project with 3GPP running this convergence between their core networks and ours, and how to resolve some of the coexistence kind of issues between the two. Connected Home, obviously, we've been very active in for a very long time. So through protocols like TR69, and now the extension into what we call USP. Cloud, which I'll talk a little bit more about, obviously, here. And then access, which we've always obviously been very active in. And, you know, probably what could be criticized from you know, in the broadband space, that this has always been a bit of a walled garden. You know, there have been obviously a lot of proprietary management within the access space. But this is something that we've been particularly addressing in the last 2 years. And I'll go into one particular project which we think is particularly important for really opening up the access space, so to make it sort of truly, completely interoperable, and then ready to be automated. We have 70 projects underway, and there's a whole list on the website which you can go and look at. Now, before I go into a project we call Broadband Access Abstraction, I'm just going to give you a very sort of potted history here, and I'll go through this pretty quickly. There are a few eye charts, but for any of you that are in the broadband space, you'll recognize some of these. So this first one is, so this is TR101, which is basically the basis for every broadband network, bar the MSOs, in the world. Virtually every telco provider is based off of this same architecture. But given this is changing, but this was the basis for all of those networks. We move on. So then the next sort of stage was really was introducing GPON into this environment. EPON was also added in as well, but mostly by the IEEE, but in consultation with us. So the EPON picture looks very similar to what we developed. And the idea here obviously was to introduce GPON into a broadband network, but it was also to make it much more open. So TR-156, which was the baseline document, is the basis for how we introduced much higher levels of interoperability into GPON particularly, but as I say, there was a partner project on the EPON side as well. So this kind of laid the basis for having that much more open network. It increased deployments massively because complexity went down, cost went down, management was much more effective. Again, a little bit of an eye chart, but this is how you fitted in PON into that TR-101 architecture. So all of the interfaces being identified, all being standardized, and working with our partners, not just in the IEEE, but also the ITU. So what this then led to, once we had all of this as conformance, was then to drive certification between the various elements, which then really did open up this kind of big open network. And after this, GPON deployments did increase quite rapidly. We've recently introduced for NGPON2 an XGS-PON as well. Okay, so then kind of the discussion then moved on to sort of say, okay, so we've standardized the management across broadband to one level, but it's particularly in that PON area. And there was lots of discussions about how we sort of take this forward. So it was actually around 2015, there's a pretty sort of universal decision, very little kind of real argument about this, that we should take on Yang modeling across the access network. So we've taken on, again, with sort of partners with, the ITU, we've done a lot of work with FSAN and the IEEE, and of course IETF, shouldn't forget to mention them, to develop these Yang models. So, and I will sort of say, I think sort of blowing our own horn with this, but we've been quite instrumental on the Yang side for broadband. We took responsibility for certain network elements. We took responsibility for certain interfaces. And if you look at the Yang repositories now within the IETF, the ones that are identified on their public website, I think after the IETF, the BBF has taken up most of that repository. So we're very happy that we've made these advances, and it's really been with the cooperation of the vendor community. There's no doubt that, and I don't think I'm out of turn in sort of saying this, that the question about how you rationalize, how you really standardize the management models in broadband and then being able to then automate them. The issue has always been around having the agreements with the vendor community. And I think that's the significant thing that's really changed since 2015. There has been this gradual story of becoming more open and interoperability being completely established in broadband. And that's kind of why I tell this little story, of how we've developed over the years. But the move to Yang is significant. We have shown sort of some demonstrations which sort of show different vendors using Yang to manage their different elements and being able to drive this all off of one or two lines of Yang. Hasn't been done sort of before, but that obviously then leads to that point where you can say this truly can be automated. Now this, so there's another sort of project I need to mention before I move into the BAA discussion. So Cloud Central Office was our response to what was happening at the ETSI NFV ISG. It was also in response to what you saw in a lot of the open source communities, so what was sort of happening in the world of white box, and to say, okay, so from a vendor perspective, what should this kind of look like? You know, the community of interest at the Broadband Forum, and it's the reason why I mentioned the membership at the beginning, is we are that complete ecosystem. It is that complete supply chain, bar the white box piece. So in cooperation, in talking with those open source groups, and this was undertaken at a big strategy meeting we actually had, where a lot of the guys in the original Chord project were actually present. We looked at how we should really sort of address this, and the conclusion we came to was to say what we actually needed was a framework where you could fit in either those white box solutions as elements within a virtualized broadband network, you know, or you could use either white box, or you could use vendor modules. And you know, more or less what you were giving the operator with having this framework were choices. And this is one of the things we identified as being one of the issues with some of the different architectures that have been thrown up, is there was this kind of, it was an either-or approach. And we wanted to sort of say, no, there really needed to be choice. And quite frankly, I think, you know, looking at a lot of the different discussions you see today and different presentations from operators, you do see some similarities, of course, but you see differences. You know, there are differences in terms of, you know, are they working particularly with vendors in a more kind of coexistent kind of architecture? You know, are they wanting to go more forklift and it's all white box? You know, do they, you know, what kind of business models are they really sort of pursuing? Even in terms of course, of sort of different orchestrators and, you know, different choices for sort of like for the open source projects. But what you really need to be able to drive some real economies is to have that overall sort of framework where you can make choices. So we kind of make that point at the bottom. You know, it's not another open source vehicle, because we're not trying to mimic those architectures and then come out with our own white box. That's not what we're sort of trying to do. It is to create some coexistence. And as I sort of said, you know, our driver really is this idea of migration. You know, how do you carry on having those billion subscribers and add to it effectively with these new kind of business ideas and you know, potentially new revenue. So one thing we sort of did as part of this Cloud Central Office project was then to say, well, you know, this is not just a question of delivering traditional technical reports, which, you know, the Broadband Forum has always been known for, you know, the typical kind of old-fashioned kind of specifications. It was no longer just that. I mean, you still need specifications, you still need requirements-driven work, you still need to identify interfaces, you know, architectures, you still need all those things, but you need practical development of the work. So Open Broadband Labs, we opened the first one in Beijing. We've just opened one in Berlin. These are open for use by our members, you know, actually arguably by non-members as well. We do want these to be open resources to be able to really sort of test against the framework for Cloud Central Office, to be able to test against various of our other specifications as well, but also, again, with the open source community. We don't want to sort of see this as being a sort of siloed approach. We don't want it to be sort of seen as being an either-or approach. You know, you don't have to go just down that vendor path, and you don't have to just go down that open source path. So, you know, how we sort of see this innovation sort of like, so this path sort of moving forward is, and I suppose this is probably the sort of key difference we think between typically what you sort of see in a open source software development and what you see in a standardized development is really this sort of idea of it being very kind of like a product roadmap. So you're documenting everything, you're prototyping your solution as you move forward. And so that's kind of, so the open broadband piece sort of fits into, as you're developing those Yang modules, of course, then you're kind of going through to sort of testing in that environment, you're doing the sort of paperwork, but you're also been able to integrate it with both open source white box solutions, but also completely vendor-driven proprietary solutions. But what you end up with is something which is completely well documented, completely tested to be able to be integrated into that real network. I won't sort of say too much sort of like about this. So this is the Cloud Central Office projects and the various elements sort of behind it, and how we put the original kind of thinking to sort of together. As you can sort of see, there are particular places where we call out the issues around coexistence and migration. We have testing projects underway now, both in terms of conformance, but also for migration. And migration really is obviously a very thorny subject. We don't underestimate this in any way. It is certainly not an easy thing to resolve, particularly when you just look at the fact of how many different kinds of deployments are out there. There certainly isn't just one picture. Unfortunately, I would sort of say since the days of TR101, when every network looked pretty similar, that's not really so true anymore. So how you test against those various different networks is not totally straightforward. But again, that's the reasoning for the Open Broadband Labs. So this is what we're looking for in terms of introducing new technologies into this current network. So migration, coexistence, and of course, agility. So BAA. So let me sort of say a bit more about this. So it's Broadband Access Abstraction. It is an open source project, so it's delivered under an Apache 2 license. It is, we think, truly open source. We do separate out the requirements and architectural documents from the actual software that's delivered. So some of that is delivered under traditional Broadband Forum IP policy. So that's under a RAND policy. We did have a lot of debate about how you sort of do this, and we think it was very important that we develop the mechanisms to be able to marry open source with open broadband. I know on Monday, on the first, or the day zero of this conference, there was a gathering of the different standards bodies, and I'm sorry I couldn't be here for that, because this would have been part of that discussion. How you marry open source and open standards is not totally straightforward, but very, very worthwhile. Because if you can do this kind of effectively, you end up in a sort of situation where you can really exploit the agility of open source, but as I said sort of previously, having the kind of the discipline of delivering those open standards specifications. So, there's very sort of specific sort of things we were sort of trying to deliver, with BAA. So this is management across, various sort of different broadband network elements. So, obviously we're trying to reduce risk for introducing those new technologies, looking at reducing the sort of cost of validation, that the service providers could deploy a lot more sort of rapidly, and more to the point, manage across those different network elements from different vendors in exactly the same way. We know that this has been the biggest, challenge. When we actually showed a demonstration of this at the Broadband World Forum. So this is one I was kind of alluding to earlier. And I'll say exactly who it was. You know, we don't always sort of do this, but I think I've got to be kind of candid about this. So we had a demonstration where we showed two broadband elements. One was Huawei, one was Nokia. It was driven off of some very simple lines of Yan code. It was a very quick demonstration. It was one of those ones you kind of, you know, you blink and you miss it because it was very sort of simple and straightforward, but it was driven off of those simple lines of code. It turned on both boxes. Both were validated immediately. And every single operator that came through that demonstration, it was just, every single time it was, wow. You know, why? The only question I really sort of got that was kind of trickier to answer was, why hasn't this happened before? Because it really wasn't rocket science. It was, you know, I like to sort of say that I think it's a question of sort of timing. There's reasons why things sort of happen when they do in the sort of standard space. You know, there's times when things are standardized. There's times when, you know, I suppose just, you know, when the timing is right. And the timing has come around. It's being pursued quite aggressively. We've now had 2 releases of the BAA code. Both are publicly available. They're both on our GitHub site. They can be downloaded by anyone. They're publicly available. We're rapidly moving on our 3rd release. We have a pretty big list of the hardware, you know, the system vendors that are involved, more joining. I think part of maybe what you could sort of argue is that the open source groups have had a very positive effect. That maybe is what tells you about the sort of timing, is that the vendors are really standing up and you know, doing what the operators are really looking for. And I think, you know, maybe what this now leads to is that we can really sort of drive to the point now where, you know, you can drive full automation within a broadband network. These are the kind of enablers that you need to have in place. So here's that list of member companies that are involved. I would certainly encourage any of you that are kind of interested, sort of take a look, go on the website. You can contact me personally. I think it's a very interesting sort of time. Certainly we encourage involvement in the labs, and certainly if you're interested, then let me know. And one thing I should sort of end on with the labs is that I saw a couple of weeks ago. And I think, you know, maybe there's some serendipity here in terms of timing, but there was a letter from 5 European operators complaining about interoperability in the virtualization space. Maybe the timing for this is exactly right, is that this is one way that you can really help that issue of interoperability, is to have completely neutral labs where you're seeing the vendors actually working together, and potentially, of course, the white boxes. So that's it. Thank you very much.